Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this special webinar. My name is Tim Gray. I'm Executive Director of Environmental Defence Canada, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's live talk, Energy, Jobs, and Transition. If you don't know us, and I hope most of you do, Environmental Defence is a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with government, industry, and individuals to defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm here in the city of Toronto, and I'm on the traditional, ancestral, and unsurrendered territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the rightful title holders and stewards of this land. And we were invited into the Dish with One Spoon Treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Today, we are all calling in from different locations, and I encourage all of us who are non-Indigenous to learn about the land we are on today. As we start this webinar, let us keep in mind that as Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustice. Today we have three great speakers with us, and I think you're really going to enjoy everything that they have to say. I know I'm really looking forward to it, having spent a little bit of time preparing for this webinar and digging into the material. Our first speaker today is Catherine Abreu, who's the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. Second up, we'll have Jim Stanford, who is an economist and Director of the Centre for Future Work. And closing off our speaker series, and just before we get into conversation, we'll have Melina Laboucan-Massimo, who's founder of Sacred Earth Solar and Just Transition Director at Indigenous Climate Action. Catherine, Jim. Before we get started, I just want to explain a bit about how you can interact with us live on this webinar. If you're joining us live on YouTube or Facebook, there's a chat box at the bottom or the right of your screen. Make sure you say hello there or discuss with each other or send us questions as well. We usually get a large volume, so we won't be able to answer them all, but we'll try and answer as many as possible and try and pull out some themes to keep the conversation going. I just want to provide a little bit of context from our perspective in environmental defense. Just on this topic of justice and transition. We talk about this quite a bit within our organization, and we really want to make clear that the ideas of transitions, that's energy transitions, economic transition, social transition, it's not a concept for the future or things we need to do eventually, but things that are actually happening right here and now. The world is moving off fossil fuels, more slowly than we'd like, but grudgingly in some ways, but it's already happening. The only choices we have to make is whether we and our governments on our behalf help to guide these changes to our benefit or just let economic forces alone determine our future. Some of the elements of this transition we can control and guide are the speed of the transition for the climate and nature, opportunities to maximize benefit of new approaches to energy systems in a way that supports people, jobs, and communities, and how to get government to focus on enabling these opportunities of this ongoing and fundamental shift, and not to make the mistake of doubling down with our money and our future on trying to protect fossil fuel industry investors. So today we're going to explore first opportunities in the transition away from fossil fuels, follow that with some stories from communities where change is being made real, and then get some thoughts on how to protect workers in the fossil fuel industry from the changes that are already underway and that are going to come in the future. So let's get started. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Catherine Abreu is an internationally recognized award-winning campaigner whose work centers on building powerful coalitions to advance transformative action on climate change. She is the Executive Director of Climate Action Network, Réseau de Climat, or CANRAC Canada, a coalition of more than 100 organizations operating from coast to coast to coast. Catherine joined after leading the energy and climate programs at the Ecology Action Centre, Atlantic Canada's longest-running environmental advocacy organization. She's also the former coordinator of the Atlantic Canada Sustainable Energy Coalition. Catherine, over to you.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having me, Tim, and to the Environmental Defense team who pulled this webinar together. Just double checking that you can see my slides. Great, all right, let's get started. So I'm gonna kick us off with a little bit of a kind of scene setting conversation. What is it that we're talking about today, and why is it important for us to be talking about it? And why is it exciting? I think that's this is a part of my work that I find really gratifying and exciting. And so, yeah, I want to share some of that excitement with you. I should say I'm here calling in from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in what is also known as Ottawa. And if you want to find me on Twitter, I've put my Twitter handle there in the bottom right-hand corner. So I'm actually starting with a cartoon that a lot of folks, and certainly I have done this, and their climate presentations on, but I'm beginning with it because it depicts one of the core concepts that I think we should bring into our conversation today. And that is the fact that climate action often isn't just about reducing emissions. We talk about it sometimes in isolation, as if it's just about reducing emissions, but in fact, many climate policies, regulations, different interventions have co-benefits that significantly improve our everyday lives while driving emissions down. And indeed, those of us who work on climate action, and a big part of what it is we're here to talk about today, are really concerned with how we use this huge transformation that we have to undertake in order to address the climate crisis, to also address a series of injustices, inequities that exist within our economic and social systems. We want to be building a better world while also taking action on climate change. And I think this does a really good job, this cartoon, of articulating the marriage between those two objectives and the incredible co-benefits that climate action can often come with. So let's dig into this a little bit with this clever video from Clean Energy Canada. And have a grounded example of this kind of co-benefits that I'm talking about. So we have this issue in Canada: emissions from cars and trucks are continuing to go up. Canadians are continuing to buy large vehicles. And this is, one of the responsible for about a quarter of emissions in this country is emissions from our transportation sector. We're also seeing a decline in manufacturing jobs in Canada, which has a significant implication for workers and communities. And what Clean Energy Canada is saying with this video is that we can solve for both of those problems by pivoting to electric cars. We can be driving our emissions down, taking advantage of some Canadian advantages, specific Canadian advantages that we have at our disposal, while creating jobs and building the economy. And indeed, we actually saw in the last year some really significant advancements on Canada investing in electric vehicle manufacturing. A lot of this led by the labor union Unifor. We've seen major investments in Ford electric vehicle manufacturing, Fiat, as well as GM. And this is creating thousands of jobs in Canada and big investments in the Canadian economy. We often talk about this work under a frame of just transition, and I wanted to dig into this lingo a little bit because I think it can be a bit jargony, but it's a phrase a lot of us have heard as we've been thinking through the interlinkages between workforce transition, decarbonization, and the transformation of Canada's economy. So let's unpack this jargon a little bit, while also acknowledging that these transitions, this transformation that we're talking about, comes under a bunch of different names and phrases. And while this phrase can sometimes be a little jargony and sometimes alienating, it does play a particular role within the international climate regime. So part of why we've heard this phrase a lot in recent years is because after a lot of campaigning work that was done on the part of labor unions, we got the phrase just transition mentioned in the landmark Paris Agreement, the climate treaty signed at the UN in 2015. So we have a reference to the fact that the action on climate change that parties to the Paris Agreement are taking need to take into account the creation of decent work and quality jobs and the transition of the local workforce. I said that mention of just transition in the Paris Agreement came on the heels of years of long work on the part of civil society and workers and labor unions. Indeed, the International Labor Organization was deeply involved in landing that win. And I think it's really useful reflecting on how the ILO thinks about this issue and brings in the fact that we are talking not just about job creation and job upgrading, but we're also needing to zero in on social justice and poverty eradication, using this shift toward an environmentally and socially sustainable economy to address some of those social inequities that I mentioned earlier on. This has meant a pretty large explosion in the conversation about just transition in different parts of the world. So here's just a flyover, a series of examples from the International Trade Union Congress's Just Transition Center of just transition efforts underway in different jurisdictions. So we see this report from the Just Transition Center that includes a Canadian example, but also examples from Germany, New Zealand, Norway, Nigeria, and Spain. The Just Transition Commission in Scotland has been thinking through options for workers and communities as they transition away from coal and toward renewable energy in Scotland. The New Zealand Council of Trade Unions has developed an entire concept of how we can be transitioning to good green jobs in that country. And let's bring it here home. This thinking around just transition has been happening in Canada for decades now. So I just wanted to share with you this archive of some leading thinking that was done by the Canadian Labour Congress way back in 2000 on just transition, where they laid out a series of principles for how workers and communities affected by the transitions that are necessary, that are necessitated by environmental action, how that transition can be undertaken in a socially just and equitable way. And indeed, we saw that Canadian leadership on thinking through the implications of just transition and working with communities in that conversation with the launch of the Canadian Task Force on Just Transition for Canadian Coal Power Workers and Communities in 2017. That task force delivered a final report in 2018. And while their recommendations, some of which were designed to be specific for coal sector workers and communities, many of them are applicable to the kind of larger conversation around transition and transformation in Canada. So I would encourage any of you who haven't yet had a chance to take a look at the work of the Just Transition Task Force to do so, because I think a lot of the work that they did with coal communities will be useful for us into the future. And again, just a flyover overview of the fact that there are many just transition and emerging conversations happening across Canada, in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Saskatchewan, Alberta, in the West Kootenays and BC and everywhere else. And we've been trying to tell the stories of some of these great conversations that are bringing people together in different parts of the world, in different parts of the country, through our Pathways to Zero series at Climate Action Network Canada, which you can take a look at climateactionnetwork.ca, Pathways to Zero. So a big message here is it's not just about changes in the workforce, it's about community and systems level transformation, and really looking forward to hearing from Jim and Melina as they give us some of those examples of the systems level and community level transformation that we're talking about. The Indigenous Environmental Network does an amazing job of taking on the community transformation aspect of just transition. So I would also encourage you to take a look at some of their principles, because Indigenous Environmental Network expands the notion of just transition to include the ways in which Indigenous communities are transforming, and the ways in which other communities are seeking access to more equitable social and environmentally friendly solutions. I'm going to end with a personal story. So I'm going to bring this home before I hand it off to the other speakers. So I'm a Maritimer. My whole Canadian family's from the Maritimes. I'm proving it by showing you this picture of me in the Atlantic Ocean in November. But I grew up in Toronto. And the reason I grew up in Toronto is because through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, as industries in Atlantic Canada began to decline, primarily natural resource industries, governments saw the writing on the wall of the decline of those natural resources industries, but didn't do anything to plan for workers and communities amidst those declines. And so we're now in a position where Atlantic Canadians are migrating out of that region of the country in order to find jobs in other parts of the country on a regular basis. And this means there are multi-generational impacts to communities when governments see things changing and fail to plan for it. And part of what we're saying is we have the opportunity to plan for this right now. And so that's why we need to be doing it. These transitions are already underway. Communities are having these conversations. And so now let's take advantage of the time that we have to make those plans. And a big part of that conversation in 2021 revolves around how we use the COVID-19 recovery moment to put us on track to this just and equitable transformation. And part of what helps to define that conversation for me are the principles for a just recovery that over 600 groups came together around last year in 2020 that really lay out a framework for how governments should be using the COVID-19 response period to build a more just and equitable society. Because this moment of COVID-19 is a real reminder that the status quo can and must be disrupted. And I believe we are standing on the threshold between the old world and the next one. And it's really up to us to actively choose and build the future we want. And I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Tim. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Kat. Your story at the end, the personal story, I think is a really important one. And we're going to dive into that. How do we best plan for this future with our next speaker? For those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from Catherine Abreu of Climate Action Network Canada. And next we have with us Jim Stanford. Jim is an economist and director of the Centre for Future Work. He divides his time between Sydney, Australia, and Vancouver. Jim is one of Canada's best-known economic communicators and commenters. He served for over 20 years as an economist and director of policy with Unifor, Canada's largest private sector trade union. Formerly, you might know it as the Canadian Auto Workers, which is the name it used to have. Jim received his PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research in New York. He's the author of Economics for Everyone, a short guide to the economics of capitalism, which has been published in 6 languages. And I always like reading everything that Jim ever writes. So Jim, over to you.
Tim, thank you very much, and your whole team at Environmental Defense for the wonderful work that you're doing, and for the invitation to participate in this campaign for a fair and decent and well-supported climate transition. I should mention that I'm speaking from Vancouver today, where the water, I think, is almost as cold as the water that Kat was swimming in that picture. But it is also the unceded terrain of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, and I do want to pay my respects to them and their communities. I thought Tim's initial comments and Kat's remarks as well were just bang on. Particularly stressing the point that these transitions are happening. This isn't an abstract idea somewhere in the future. The transitions are happening, and the only choice we have is whether we want that to be a planned, supported, fair transition, or whether we just want more of the same chaos and disruption and dislocation that the so-called private energy markets will produce of their own accord. I'll show you statistics that 50,000 fossil fuel workers in Canada have already lost their jobs since 2014. That is the transition. And every time Jason Kenney, an oil company CEO, stands up and says, I'm in favor of fossil fuel workers, I'm here to support their jobs, frankly, they should be struck by lightning, because they're all doing everything they can to fatten their own bottom lines at the expense of fossil fuel workers who are suffering because of this unplanned, chaotic, business-driven transition. So this isn't a question of whether a transition occurs or not. It's a question of what kind of transition it is, and whether the interests of workers and communities are looked after, not just the interests of business, and whether we get ahead of the curve and exert some control and agency, or whether we wait for someone else to tell us what to do at the end. And again, I thought Kat's reference to previous transitions in Canada's economic history was 100% relevant. Think of the cod fishery collapse in the early 1990s in Newfoundland, another environmentally driven but delayed, deferred, denied, catastrophic change. And that is an example of how transitions, if we don't plan for them, will be far, far more harmful. I'm speaking from a report that I worked on with Environmental Defense called Employment Transitions and the Phase Out of Fossil Fuels. I invite watchers to check out the full report at our website, centerforfuturework.ca, and Environmental Defense has also produced some helpful summaries. I look forward to carrying on the discussion. My Twitter handle's there at the bottom and the center's as well. You're welcome to tweet from this presentation. A lot of misconceptions out there about the jobs impact of climate transition. A lot of scaremongering, of course, from those who are trying to deny and defer the transition and keep fossil fuels protected and subsidized for as long as they possibly can, even though the oil companies themselves know this is happening. And proof of that is how the oil companies have responded to the rebound in oil prices that has occurred from April and May of last year. Remember, when oil prices hit negative levels, they all cut back, of course, on their employment and their investment. Now oil prices are back up, but they are not increasing their investment and employment, not at all. They are quite explicit. Their desire here is to make as much money as they can while they're able to and pay it out in dividends and other payback to the shareholders. So they know that this transition is happening. But they will still try to use the argument and the fear of unemployment to delay and defer the measures that are needed to make sure the transition is a successful one. And one of the misconceptions that they deliberately promote is that Canada's economy is so dramatically dependent on fossil fuels, and that's just quite wrong. So one of the first things we do in the report is try to map out the dimensions of direct fossil fuel employment in Canada. We added up across all of the major employing sectors. And in 2019, this is before the COVID pandemic, of course, there were about 160,000 waged jobs in direct fossil fuel industries. That's under 1% of total employment. We can also include some of the self-employment in fossil fuel industries, and that takes us to about 170,000 jobs in total. This was before the pandemic. That was down over 30,000 positions since 2014 when world oil prices began to collapse. So again, already that transition is occurring. And as a share of total employment in Canada's economy, the transition is gathering speed. Since 2014, it's fallen by over a quarter, from a little over 1% to below 1%. Interesting thing, if you extrapolated that downward trend, you'd get to zero within about 20 years. So we're already on a path to phasing out fossil fuel jobs, direct fossil fuel jobs in Canada. The question is, how are we going to do it? And two things are happening here. The number of fossil fuel jobs is shrinking as fossil fuel industries are adjusting to the decline in prices and the decline in world demand and the surge in more competitive alternatives, namely renewables. The other thing that's happening is the denominator of that ratio, that is the overall level of employment in Canada, is growing. Until the pandemic, it was growing quite rapidly. So the combination of job creation in other sectors plus the gradual decline, or and sometimes more than gradual decline in fossil fuel industries, is sinking that ratio very quickly. Now, if it was just a question of under 1% of total employment spread across Canada, this would be a non-issue. We wouldn't even notice the phase out of an industry across Canada that employed less than 1% of workers. But it's because fossil fuels themselves are regionally concentrated, then the jobs are also regionally concentrated. And this is what makes it a much more challenging issue in Canada. Of course, it's the oil-producing provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador, Saskatchewan, and especially Alberta, where fossil fuel jobs are relatively more important. In the report, we also drill down to the community level, and there are some communities where fossil fuels are clearly dominant as a direct source of employment. And that is a very hard nut to crack. That is a challenge, because how are those communities in particular going to adjust, especially if they're remote from other population centers, and if they don't have a diverse local economy with other industries that people could move into. The good news is that there aren't that many communities that are highly dependent on fossil fuels. We counted 18 census-defined communities in Canada where fossil fuel jobs made up over 5% of total employment. The worst is Fort McMurray, and it's the worst for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's the most fossil fuel dependent, over 30% of jobs there. Number two, it's a community that's far, far away from most other population centers, so that makes it all the harder to adjust. But there are other places like Fort Fort McMurray, and the number of communities that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels is quite small. So the good news of this is if we make it a national priority, and it should be a national priority to support fossil fuel workers and fossil fuel communities as this transition occurs, we can concentrate our resources and our support on that relatively small number of communities and do a lot for them. So in that regard, the regional concentration is a problem, but it is one that can be addressed. A really important dimension to keep in mind as we're imagining how this transition occurs is the fact that Canada's labor market is constantly transitioning. This isn't the first transition in history, as we've talked about. In fact, Canada's economy is a history of boom and bust of different industries, most of them resource-based, that came and went because technology changed, taste changed, competition changed, and we found better things to do. I always like to point out that our major export at one point in time was beaver pelts, and we don't do that anymore. And it isn't because we ran out of beavers, okay? It's because the world didn't need beaver pelts anymore. They found other things to make hats out of. And exactly the same thing is happening now because the world is finding other ways to produce energy, much better ways to produce energy. It's not just those historical transitions, though. It's the day-to-day flux and flow in our labor market. And there's a whole set of statistics provided in this paper that show just how dramatic that ongoing change is. And it means that there's no status quo. First of all, we can't pretend that this won't happen and then just try to freeze the labor market the way it is. It's constantly changing. But if we enlist those regular forces of change, we can actually make the transition, especially if it's planned and phased in over many years, we can make that transition smooth and avoid the big disruptions. Retirement is a crucial one. Fossil fuel workers on average are older than most Canadian workers. 55% of them are over 40. That means most of them are going to retire within the 20-year or whatever period that we choose to try to phase out fossil fuel production and use. So it isn't a question of finding them another job. It's a question of supporting them as they finish their careers. And also making sure that we don't bring in new people, younger workers, to start in a career in an industry that has no future. Huge amounts of churn and normal turnover in fossil fuel industries. Over 20%, over 1 worker in 5 is changing jobs in the course of any year. And harnessing that in a planned way is going to be key to making sure that this transition occurs. Just as a simple example, even if you assume just a 10% exit rate, 10% severance rate, which is lower than what we experience in fossil fuel industries every year, you start with an initial stock of employment, and this graph 100 people, and within a 20-year period, 85% of the people have left. So what you have to do is harness that prospective change over time and make sure you're heading in the direction towards a benchmark, a target of phase out that you want to have. We could phase out all direct fossil fuel jobs in Canada over a 20-year period, and that would mean a reduction in fossil fuel employment of about 8,000 jobs per year. That's less than occurred over the last 5 years. Now, remember, the rest of the economy is producing jobs all the time. Of course, the pandemic has been something different, but we're going to come out of the pandemic and we're going to continue to create new work across the country. The whole economy produces 8,000 new jobs every 10 days. So this is not an unreasonable task. This is an eminently manageable task, one that we adjust to all the time. And remember, most of those people are going to retire. It's not a question of finding a new job for a fossil fuel worker. If it's planned, they will just move normally into their regular retirement. So let's say half of those jobs have to be replaced with new work. That's 4,000 jobs per year. You could give those workers and the communities they live in a very, very strong level of support. Let's say $250,000 each for adjustment, retraining, relocation, income insurance, or early retirement. That's a $1 billion a year transition task to support 4,000 fossil fuel workers to move on to the next phase of their life. $1 billion a year is nothing in the grand scheme of the costs that are associated with regular energy investments, and let alone the growth of renewables. I would like to see the federal government move forward with its Just Transition Act, and I'd like to see them put $1 billion a year into supporting workers in this transition, and this proves that we could do it. Everybody says, what are the alternative jobs going to be? And of course, we gravitate to the renewable energy opportunities, and so we should. There's lots of interesting opportunities and lots of jobs there. Remediation jobs, cleaning up abandoned orphan wells and cleaning up old mines and so on will also help. But we shouldn't, for a minute, limit our attention to those particular sectors. It's not a question of connecting one dot, fossil fuel energy, to the other dot, renewable energy, and say that's how the labor market transition is going to occur. You have less than 1% of people working in fossil fuels. You'll have maybe 1% of people, I think it'll be about the same number, in renewable energy. Why would we ignore the other 98% of the labor market in the course of that transition? So we have to remember that all the other sectors that are in the economy, including things like healthcare, construction, manufacturing, technology, all of those offer great opportunities for fossil fuel workers who do need to find another job. Another point is that over half of fossil fuel jobs are in cities. So this is going to help. Fort McMurray and places like that are the hard nuts to crack, but most fossil fuel jobs are actually in cities where there's a whole diverse range of different industries where people can work to. And remember, most fossil fuel workers won't need to find a new job at all. Great examples in history and in other countries about how to do this. Perhaps the gold standard is how Germany phased out its black coal mining industry. 80,000 jobs phased out over a 20-year period. Not one involuntary layoff, not one, because they did it right. They planned it, they set annual benchmarks, they allowed people to move, the younger workers to move from one mine to the other. They supported it with alternative job creation, early retirement and severance packages and more. There's other examples of how it can be done in Netherlands, in how Ontario phased out coal power, in how Spain is closing its coal mines. It takes a plan, it takes government intervention, and it takes a commitment. So this is the time to set the plan. Time is the best friend of a transition. So let's get ahead of this. Let's set a 20-year timetable to phase out fossil fuel production and use with an annual targets to meet along the way. Let's facilitate mobility as the whole industry shrinks and declines over time. Have mobility so that the younger workers can move to keep their jobs for longer as the older workers retire. Let's put targeted support into places like Fort McMurray to both develop alternative industries, but also help people move if they want to. The renewable jobs and remediation jobs can help, but frankly, they'll be a small part of the big picture. We could come out with a very, very strong commitment. No forced layoffs. That's how Germany did it. That's how Ontario Hydro did it when they got rid of coal power. We could do that here. Income protection, and that would change the discussion completely. So thank you very much, Tim and your team, for what you're doing. I look forward to continuing this great movement.
Thanks so much, Jim. I think everything you had to say there was really interesting. I think it really kind of begs the question: will Canada, as a society, choose to do things differently than what happened when other industries went through major transitions, like forests, like fisheries, etc. And we really need to ask ourselves if we want to do things differently here. And those are some great ideas. For all of you who are just joining us now, we just heard from Jim Stanford, and we're going to go on to our last speaker now. And I want to introduce Melina. Melina is going to really dive into some of these really concrete examples of really interesting things that are going on the ground. Melina Laboucan-Massimo is Laboucan-Cree from Northern Alberta. Melina is the founder of Sacred Earth Solar, co-founder and Just Transition Director at Indigenous Climate Action, and a fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation. She is the host of a new TV series called Power to the People, which profiles renewable energy in Indigenous communities across the country. Melina holds a master's degree in Indigenous governance from the University of Victoria with a focus on renewable energy. As part of her master's thesis, Melina implemented a 20.8 kilowatt solar project in her home community of Little Buffalo, which now powers the health center in the heart of the tar sands. Melina, over to you.
Hi, thank you, Tim. My name is Melina Miawapin Laboucan-Massimo. As Tim said, I am Laboucan-Cree, Nihiao from Northern Alberta, born and raised in Alberta and from the tar sands. And we're going to just dive right in. I am currently on the unceded Coast Salish territories of the Klahoose Nation in the Northern Gulf Islands, where I currently make my home, and I'm happy to be here as a visitor as I am Indigenous from Alberta. Indigenous peoples, have been raising the alarm bell for decades and decades, now along climate scientists, because Indigenous peoples are very much connected to the land. They saw climate change coming much before, I would say, the Canadian population did. And so we actually have prophecies that came even that talks about the time that we are now in. So it talks about, prophecy speaks of a time during the seventh fire when our people will have a choice between two paths. The first path is well-worn and scorched. The second path is a new and green. It is our choice as communities and as individuals which path we will choose. And so that, for me, when I read that quote, refers to what a just transition looks like, because, where I'm from, we are starting to see the scorched earth. So I'm going to do the opposite of what Kat did. I'm going to set the stage of my community, where I come from, and why I've pushed for a just transition and started implementing solar 6 years ago in Indigenous communities across the country. So I'm from, as I said, the Northern Boreal Forest, which is the northern lungs of Mother Earth. So it's one of the ways in which we combat climate change, because the northern lungs of Mother Earth are very much what, keep carbon in, and that's the natural carbon sequestration that we are actually downing right now in the tar sands and downing for oil and gas logging and now fracking. So you can see here the Boreal and where I come from, my community, and my dad, who was actually hidden from residential school. If you go to the next slide, you can see that similar to what John was talking about was the full impact of, where we are in the tar sands and just how it's very difficult to transition workers. And so my focus has been to transition communities. For me, the just transition came about from an oil spill. So an oil spill happened in 2011, one of the largest in Alberta's and Canada's history, 4.5 million liters leached on our traditional territory. And so you can see people in our family and community cleaning the oil spill, and then 18 months later, me still digging out oil from our homelands when the company had said it was clean. So the impact is very much on our homelands. If you go to the next slide. So a lot of people couldn't breathe. People's eyes were burning. People could not deal with people were had to shut everything down. The school was shut down. Everything was shut down. It was really intense to go through that experience and see my family and community have to deal with what was happening on the ground. So the cultural and environmental genocide, further encroachment upon our traditional territories. This is the beauty of what our land looks like. The next slide goes to kind of the impact, industrialized landscapes, drained and polluted highways. So this is the context in which Indigenous communities are dealing with a just transition. We're not talking about cities. We're not talking about municipalities. We're talking about, majority of the time, communities that are already facing the brunt of environmental degradation and climate change. The bigger question is, what does a just transition look like to renewable energy for us in places like the tar sands? So from an Indigenous perspective and worldview, our Indigenous worldview and philosophy is much more in alignment with renewable energy. And so when we are talking about renewable energy, we are talking about how renewable energy is less extractive. It still has impact. So let's be clear about that. But there's less impact and less burning of fossil fuels. And so therefore, in a transitionary period, we have a much more reciprocal relationship of Mother Earth, is which we have not actually seen in our home communities, unfortunately, and not at our choice, but at the choice of what's being imposed upon us. As was said earlier, people don't have a choice in the communities where I come from. We are economic hostages. What I decided to build in my home community, which is called Pitapan, which is a solar project that we erected in 2015, which was actually before any of the policy existed in Alberta to implement solar for communities. And then there was, once the Nutley government came in, there was an ushering in of more renewable energy projects. But this project went up in response to, what we were experiencing, like the oil spill that I showed earlier. What we decided to do was train up people alongside in the community. So this picture is of Carlton, who is 21, who is one of those people that, has only option is to work in the tar sands, work in oil and gas, work in fracking, or work in logging. So those are his options if he wants to stay in our community. And so what I wanted to do was actually, in this transitionary period, was actually train young people and also just workers, older workers that are very, have like these amazing labor skills to build this project. You can see what we did. We did a 20.8 topple pole mount system. So the school right behind us is the school for the children from K to 12 in Little Buffalo, where I was born. It's where every day they'll see solar. And that's the first time actually people saw solar panels in our community. And first time I saw solar panels in Northern Alberta. So I think that's the really exciting thing when we talk about just transition, is that communities also are able to transition alongside workers. You can see the final installation, 80 panels. It's top of pole mount system, and it powers the health center next to the right of the system. And then behind you can see the school. We actually had a celebration, a solar feast, a launch. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a ribbon cutting ceremony that our community did in celebration of, the amazingness that is solar and is the just transition, and what it looks like when you put up projects that help people transition from fossil fuel extraction. You'll see here just some of the objectives of why I decided to focus my master's research on what reducing dependency on fossil fuel looks like in communities, what engaging an actual community, but what their vision is on what the energy future looks like to them, and what actions can we do to make those visions realized. Also, freedom from crippling costs in communities, because there's such an expensive amount of fossil fuel extraction that's happening, and then also communities that are, a lot of times offer on grids. And so when we are talking about energy efficiency and expensive propane and diesel, like my communities on propane, and it's extremely expensive to heat your homes, especially in such a cold place in the winter for so many months out of the year. Communities are spending millions and millions of dollars to heat their homes and heat their community centers from diesel. So also providing Indigenous communities the opportunity to embrace their sacred connection to the land, because that has been at the hands of the fossil fuel industry and imposing governments, severed our connection from the land, because there is immense degradation to our homelands. It's also providing a tangible solution in addressing climate change. And then there's also continued work in focusing on renewable energy and community energy audits that actually took place after the ushering in of renewable energy. So if you go to the next slide, I think this is one thing I really want to make really clear, is that, we don't only need to talk to, adults in governments and all of the people that are important to talk about what just transition looks like, but also the children, because they're inheriting this. And so what I have decided to do is go into communities and do climate literacy workshops, renewable energy workshops with kids, so they understand solar, wind, all of the different types of technologies that are out there, because they're the ones that are inheriting the future. What we heard earlier is that a lot of the people currently in these industries are not going to be the ones that are, inheriting the future of jobs in this country. So yeah, the creation came about Sacred Earth Solars, which is one of the organizations that I run. You can see more. I won't go too much into the other projects that I've put up, because we are on limited time here today, but you can go to the website sacredearth.solar, and you can see more videos about putting up other solar projects across the country. And you can also see the video that I talked about back home about us putting up solar and interviewing different people in the community, and how excited people were and still are to have that project up and running in our community. I'm going to close with talking really quickly about a TV show that actually just is airing in Canada, across the country. It's called Power to the People. We spent about the past 3 years filming. We went from coast to coast to coast. We went to 26 locations across the country in Indigenous communities that are implementing geo-exchange, biomass, district energy, run-of-the-river. Majority of them small to medium scales, but also large scale revenue generating projects, wind farms, solar farms. And so it's called Power to the People. You can watch it online, or you can watch it on TV on APTN. If you go to the next slide, and you can also go to the website powertopeople.tv. And then here you can see the different stories, powertothepeople.tv, and it talks about all these amazing stories from communities around Gull Bay First Nation, 6 Nations of the Grand River, housing projects, energy efficiency, solar, microgrids, Run of the River. It's a really exciting episode and series that gave me a lot more hope and inspiration for the future, because like we've heard from the previous panelists, the future is here, the future is now. We have up to already in this country 2,500 Indigenous-led renewable energy projects across this country, and 200 of them medium to large-scale revenue generating projects that are bringing actually millions back into communities to, support local programming, school language revitalization, purchasing fire trucks. It's amazing. So watch if you want to hear more and be inspired. I know there's a lot of, as people have been in COVID, a lot of binging in the world on like, Netflix and all the things, but feel free to binge on Power to the People and be inspired. There's 13 episodes. They're a half an hour. It just gives you like a nice shot of what's happening out there. Cause I think a lot of times we see articles and we see photos, but this is like, us visiting communities and talking to the people that have implemented these projects on the ground. So yeah, power binge. As Catherine just called it in our private chat. And so the last slide is just us. As I said, I'm the founder of Sacred Earth Solar and the co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, where I work as a Just Transition Director. Here's me on my socials. Follow us. We are on all of the socials: Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. So follow us and learn more about this work that we are working on. So thank you so much, Environmental Defense, for having me. And I hope everybody continues to stay safe and healthy in their families and communities. Hi, thank you.
Thanks all of our speakers. I think it was fantastic. Lots and lots of information to digest there, and lots of questions coming in from our audience for the next few minutes. I just have a couple myself. I just thought that came to mind for me, and I'll keep that short because I do want to get some from the audience. But Melina, I think it's really inspiring what you were saying about making something tangible for people on the ground. A lot of this stuff, gets really heady really quickly, and necessarily so. But providing examples of the future on the ground, I think, is so important, and in particular in communities, but even more particular in Indigenous communities, which have been at the receiving end of kind of take this technology and instead having some authorship and ownership and agency and in actually doing something different. And I just wonder if you could comment on that, just from an empowerment perspective. How does that change the way that people think about their future when suddenly they can be actually owning something that's producing energy, and maybe even selling it externally? How does that change their view of what the possibilities around this transition are?
I mean, I think it comes down to agency, and being the creators of the dream that you want to see for your community. As we know, the history of colonization in Canada has really imposed external foreign government policy that has determined without the consent many times or most of the time of the people. And so with the Just Transition, for me, that was really exciting was that I was like, I'm going to determine this. I'm going to connect to the grid. I'm going to figure it all out. And then now, with the Just Transition Act and things, we need to see really progressive policy that allows communities to play a part, because the people that we interviewed in Power to the People are community-based people. It's not coming from the outside, it's coming from within. And there's energy champions within these communities. This is thousands of energy champions already. And so, a really big plug to Indigenous Clean Energy. I'm on the National Steering Committee, and it's just an amazing organization. And that's where the stats came from, of that there's, 2,500 projects already. And so I think people, like Jim said, is that that they're happening on the ground, right? And especially in Indigenous communities, when it's out of sight, out of mind, just like it has been for the impact. We need to see these stories uplifted because there are leaders already doing this work.
Yeah, thanks so much. You really see the consequences of trying to do some of this work as well, where that community level engagement is either not done, or it's an afterthought, or it's done poorly. And we saw some of that in the rollout of the clean energy work that was done in Ontario with wind and solar. Despite a lot of advocacy from organizations like ours and others to include the communities in the benefits, it wasn't done that way, and ultimately you ended up with a lot less support, I think, than could have been had. And so I think this is really a message for regulators. Make it more possible for these things to happen. Don't discourage them. A question for all of you, I guess. We probably will just have the one from me and then go to the audience. If you had to pick one thing that our governments would do to ensure that this transition is going to, in fact, be just and get the Canadian public on side as quickly as possible with the possibilities of it for our future, what would you do? If you had a magic moment with the Prime Minister, what would you say? Jim, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Kat, and then end with Melina.
I'd go big, Tim. I would say, Prime Minister, you want to change both the economics and the politics of this? Make a commitment that no fossil fuel worker will be involuntarily unemployed as a result of this transition. And then that boxes it in. Then you have to do the timeline, you have to do the alternatives, you have to do severance and early retirement incentives, and the whole thing flows from there. And it would just completely disarm the fear-mongering of the Jason Kennys and energy CEOs of the world.
Thanks, that's great. Kat?
I'm going to be bad and say two. Number one, Canadian government needs to get back into the business of industrial planning. We've been out of that business for decades now. We need to be thinking about what the sectors are of the future that are going to bring us the prosperity and jobs that we want in a climate safe way. And if we're not asking those questions, then we're not investing in the right places, and we're not building the right kinds of jobs and the right skills training. Second of all, get Canadians involved in the conversation. Something that the Task Force for Coal Workers and Communities did really well was actually go to every community and have a grounded conversation about what they needed, what transition looked like for them. We need to figure out how to do that on a grander scale, because job transition is happening in this country for a bunch of different reasons, right? It's not just about climate action, it's about automation, the move to the gig economy. Bringing Canadians into that conversation, I think, is going to be really necessary. Perhaps you could do that through something like a citizens' assembly.
Great, thanks. Melina?
I would say Justin Trudeau respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and actually operationalize the UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and free, prior, and informed consent means actual consent, and the ability to say no and listen to those communities that want to determine their own futures. Thanks,
that's great. Some questions coming in from the audience here. Get to a couple, but we are running out of time just because there's so much content here. One here that I think gets back to something that Kat mentioned. What lessons can we take from the cod fishery, but also the example around the forest industry? About what the role of government is to help us move through these transitions. I've heard often, in fact, I was on a webinar the other day where people were advocating, government shouldn't be an active player in any of this, right? Don't choose winners, government stay out of it, just let the market figure it out. What can we learn from what happened with forests and cod relative to what's going on with fossil fuel? So anyone want to go first with that?
Well, I might hop in quickly. Choosing to do nothing is a choice, right? So there's this whole myth that governments can't choose winners. We need to just sit back and let the private market take care of everything. But that's a choice. That's a choice that you're making. And I think we've kind of lost track of that. So we need to be demanding that our governments make an active choice to invest in us and our futures and our communities. I think that's a big part of the answer to that question. And then the other piece of it is acknowledging the fact that, the resource sectors that have driven a lot of employment haven't arisen inevitably or as a mistake. They've been engineered that way, right? The oil sands don't exist because they were just meant to exist always. They exist because of a series of choices that were made over decades to invest political and financial resources in building that industry. And that's why a huge portion of Atlantic Canadians now travel to Alberta to get work. It's not about demonizing that. It's about acknowledging what went into making that happen and figuring out how to make it happen in a more just and equitable way across the country in ways that works for communities.
Yeah, and of course, government was very involved in moving the oil sands to a place where they could actually be exploited commercially, right? That wasn't not done with private capital initially. Jim?
100% right. Yeah, there's this claim the government can't pick winners. We have a technical term in economics for that. The term is bullshit. Bullshit. is a term defined as a hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay, so the reality is government picks winners all the time, including the fossil fuel industry, which wouldn't exist without all forms of the direct and indirect government support, ratification, and subsidy, outright subsidy. So, of course, we are going to have to invest in the industries of the future, and it's a no-brainer how to do that. And that includes things like healthcare. Healthcare is Canada's biggest single employer. It employs something like 18 times as many people as the whole fossil fuel sector. It creates more new jobs each year than enough new jobs each year to single-handedly occupy everyone who's working in fossil fuels. It's an industry that can be regionally targeted. We could be, for example, supporting Fort McMurray with big investments in healthcare and other public services. That's a form of industrial planning as well that I think can be part of the solution here.
Thanks. Melina?
I mean, I'm going to just go outside of the box here and just say, like, the fact that we think there is a free hand and a free market is just like Jim says, BS. And as from an Indigenous perspective, like, we are in a finite world and a finite planet, and we need to have an ecological economy. We cannot have economic hostages, and that's what we are right now. And so we need to transition, and that's what the transition is for. So I think we cannot exist on this in this kind of paradigm. We need a paradigm shift, is what I'm saying.
Great. Thanks so much. Just one more question from the audience, and then I think we're going to have to wrap up because we're running out of time. But one of the questions that came in here is how can we ensure that energy programs have equity goals? And it gets to some of the comment I made about Ontario. But what should government be doing to ensure as we make this energy transition that it actually includes a move towards greater equity? Melina, start with you.
Sorry, could you repeat that again? It just cut out. Sure,
yeah, sorry. How can we ensure that energy programs, renewable energy programs, actually include equity goals and that it doesn't just become another an industrial project that is exclusion of any kind of equity goals?
Definitely. I mean, an inclusion of communities from the get-go, not the afterthought. Again, ensuring that procurement comes within the community, ensuring training goes to the community, ensuring that employment is also for the community. So there needs to be a benefit of not only the company and the energy developer, the government, but also the community that is in partnership, and ensuring that there is more than like a 1% ownership. We need to be seeing like 49, 51% ownerships, majority owns for Indigenous communities, if not 100%. Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. And we are going to have to wrap up now. So I'm just going to ask the last question. What gives you hope, all of you, that we can get on the right track in this country? We haven't had a great record on making plans for transition. We've talked about that. What gives you hope that we can do it differently this time? Kat, we'll start with you, and then Melina, and then let Jim kick it forward.
I mean, what gives me hope is that there are a whole lot of people who are determined to make it happen and aren't going to lay down if it doesn't go that way. So, I mentioned the 600 plus organizations across the country that signed on to the Principles for a Just Recovery, and all of them are engaged. And there are a lot of people engaged at the community level too. So that's what's going to make it happen.
Yeah,
Great.
For me, it's implementation. It is doing it now. It is no more talking. It is like the energy champions are what give me inspiration at this point in time when we've had a lot of talk.
Great, Jim.
I agree with Kat and Melina completely, and also the economics give me hope. Frankly, like the revolutionary change in the economics of renewable energy over the last 5 or 10 years makes it obvious to anyone with a calculator in front of them that this is going to happen, and it's going to happen much faster than we thought. And I think that will overcome ultimately the short-sighted vested interests that are trying to hold us back.
Great, thanks so much. That's the end of our time. So thank you everyone for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. In addition to watching Melina's great TV show and reading Jim's report, we urge you to reach out to your MPs to demand that the upcoming budget 2021, invests in a just recovery. The government will be allocating billions to recovery funds as we come out of COVID and rebuild the economy. We must ensure that they support workers, communities, and a healthy future. You can sign our action at environmentaldefense.ca/green budget. And thanks to all of you. I want to just thank you for showing up, for listening, for supporting our work, for tuning in today. It's encouraging to see so many of you taking action to protect the environment and protecting Canada's future. Special thanks to all of our speakers today, Kat, Jim, Melina, for your expertise and insights. Fantastic. I really enjoyed doing this. Please keep in touch with Environmental Defense. You can follow us on Twitter or Facebook or reach out to us by email. Thanks very much and have a great day.